been talking before in this conference and on the panel yesterday. Also, James Hughes' book, Citizen Cyborg, is being available for your browsing just on the registration desk. So if you're interested in that, you can also order it. There's information for that also. I will just leave him to explain what he's going to talk about, and this is Dr. James Hughes.
In the last chapter of Citizen Cyborg, I have some reflections on the nature of compassion and empathy in the context of trying to talk about what characteristics of persons we want to preserve in a transhuman future as people have increasing control over their brains. And I'm writing a second book now called Cyborg Buddha, which is about this topic. So I'm very much on my mind. And one of the reasons why I think this cartoon, by the way, says, this is a military general, he says, "These are for keeping sexist or homophobic remarks to myself," which has been a problem in the U.S. military on occasion. The motivation for this talk is partly that one of the bioconservative complaints about transhumanism is that we don't, that as people have increasing control over their own brains, that it loosens the responsibility that we have for our own lives. The people will feel that they're the subject of engineering and that they no longer are in control of themselves, and they'll be able to blame their brain structure, their brain chemistry for their behavior. And I see this entirely the opposite, because I think what's actually happening is that enhancement technologies, neurotechnologies in particular, give us increasing control over our own behavior, increasing conscious control, and they increase our moral responsibility, and they'll increase the demands that society makes of us to control our own behavior, to keep homophobic and sexist comments to ourselves, for instance. Francis Fukuyama says, so who is to tell us that being human and having dignity means sticking with a set of emotional responses, he asked this rhetorically, that are the accidental byproduct of our evolutionary history? Why don't we simply accept our destiny as creatures who modify themselves? That's, of course, the transhumanist question. Francis Fukuyama says that that's a bad idea, and one of the reasons that he gives is that children who take Ritalin will no longer feel like they really accomplish things themselves, or that women who take Prozac will no longer feel like they're in control of their lives because they're taking a drug. But we've been trying to control ourselves with willpower for thousands and thousands of years. Crazy? Yeah, I'm crazy. That's the point. The only way I have to control my brain is with this hammer, and I'm going to take the fight to the enemy. That's our usual approach to problems that are only under the control of our willpower. I only have this crude tool of will, but I will do my best to lose weight, or I will do my best to control violent outbursts. But we have better tools than that. We don't have to use a hammer or maybe a marshmallow in the case of most people's willpower. So what I'm suggesting is that neurotechnology will increase our obligation to use some neurotechnologies in certain cases, and also not to use neurotechnologies. And of course, the not to use neurotechnologies part has already been a part of moral responsibility for quite a long time, because we have, for instance, alcohol, all the many consequences that alcohol and other drugs has on our behavior. This is one of the neurotechnologies we've had available to us. When we think about the different causes of auto accidents, not drinking and driving is a moral responsibility. It's a moral and it's a legal responsibility. So this is a responsibility not to impair your behavior with the neurotechnology. But now we have these additional questions, because we know that many auto accidents are caused by cell phone distraction. So we have laws that say that you can't be distracted, you can't use a technology which distracts you while you're driving. And we also now know that many auto accidents are caused by fatigue, because especially in the United States, many people are chronically sleep deprived and they fall asleep at the wheel, or they're just distracted, and fatigue causes all kinds of accidents. So now we have this drug, which we've heard in almost every presentation, modafinil, that has almost no side effects, and which increases your awareness and your ability to concentrate. And why don't we then have a responsibility, if we're fatigued, to take modafinil? That's the nature of the question. We have a responsibility not to impair ourselves by not taking a neurotechnology or not using a technology like a cell phone, why don't we have a responsibility to use a technology? J.B.S. Haldane, who was one of the progenitors of the transhumanist vision, he said, "We may be able to control our passions by some more direct method than fasting and flagellation to deal with perverted instincts by physiology rather than prison." And he didn't work much on the neurotechnology question. He was mostly a geneticist, but at least he pointed us in that direction. So first I want to talk about the difference between vice and virtue. So we have, on the one hand, vice, and on the other hand, virtue. Of course, in the classical vices and virtues model of Catholicism, each vice had a corresponding virtue. So separating what is a vice and what is a virtue, just like separating what is a therapy and what is an enhancement, is kind of complicated or meaningless. But let's start with some of the things that we think of as vices. Clearly, in terms of all of your moral behavior, all of your responsibility to other people, your ability to be compassionate, to meet your obligations in society, you're taking drugs, taking alcohol can impair those. Being dependent on a substance can impair those. And one of the concerns that I have about transhumanism and how we're portrayed in the future is that if we adopt a purely liberal notion that says that we don't mind if people wire head, as we've heard earlier as one of the concerns, that is, put a wire inside their head and just turn on their pleasure center and constantly be jacking themselves with pleasure. Or we don't mind if people are heroin addicts. Or as Jeremy Bentham said, it's fine for people just to, he implied that a utilitarian ethic would support the notion of people just having constant pleasure and not accomplishing other things with their lives. I think we need to adopt a more sophisticated statement on this and say, we believe that there is a kind of personality that society, that we can encourage one another to have, a kind of range of personalities, within which there's a great deal of diversity. But one end might be something like drug addiction or heroin addiction or methamphetamine addiction or alcohol dependency, where we think that this is the use of technology in a way that actually perverts the human capability, perverts human potential, and that we want to encourage technologies which will lead us away from those and encourage people to use technologies that lead us away. And we have, fortunately, some technologies in the pipeline which, without putting people in prison for their vices, allow people more control over those kinds of addictions and dependencies. Things like cocaine vaccines, which block cocaine receptors, the receptors in the brain that make use of cocaine and that make people more resistant to cocaine dependency. Or the buprenorphine for opiates, which is a way to overcome opiate addiction. Or naltrexone for alcohol, which causes people to be nauseous when they take when they drink. Similarly, they're being developed for nicotine. Sex addiction, a controversial idea, whether people can actually be sex addicted or not, but it is in the United States where many things are being treated as diseases that weren't previously treated as diseases. Sex addiction is being treated as a disease, and people are being treated, for instance, with Prozac and other SSRIs, and it's become helpful for some people. Of course, that suggests that it isn't really sex addiction, that it might be depression that's leading people to that behavior. But there is related evidence about what leads people to have certain kinds of sexual patterns of behavior altogether. There's this fascinating study with voles, which are these kind of insectile rodents in the United States. You see a vole there. These voles, there's one kind of vole that has monogamous behavior, that has pair bonding, and there's another kind of vole where the male has many sexual partners but never pair bonds. And they tweaked one gene in the voles that were having many partners, and that gene increased the amount of vasopressin in their brain and also some of the dopamine connection. And the voles became monogamous, like the other kinds of voles. And then they compared the two kinds of voles. And what it suggested was that this one gene increased the vasopressin. The vasopressin allowed them to, when they had sex with a particular female vole, they associated the pleasure that they were getting with that particular female. And then they no longer sought other sexual experiences. They continued to go back to that female, and they developed a pair bond with that female. So human behavior is probably 10 times or 100 times more complex than this, but it suggests that there may be biochemical modalities for controlling our sexual expression as well, and becoming more monogamous or less monogamous. I'm not a prude. If people decided that they wanted to live in polyamorous, non-monogamous communities, then perhaps they would suppress their vasopressin so they weren't as monogamous. In the New Testament, it says that Jesus says to people, "Not everyone can accept this word, but only those to whom it has been given. For some eunuchs are because they are that way because they were born that way. Others were made that way by men, and others have renounced marriage because of the kingdom of heaven. The one who can accept this should accept it." Now, I know I'm not a Christian scholar, but it seems to me like Jesus is advocating castration for men, which is a pretty profound insight about the relationship between one that I'm sure they observed often with castrati and eunuchs in those days, that testosterone is a modulator of sexual behavior and of many kinds of aggressive behavior, male typical behavior. I often say that testosterone is one of the most potent neurotoxins in the world. The degree of violence and crime in a society can be directly tied to the number of males, 15 to 25 in a society. And we may not want to systematically suppress testosterone because it has all other benefits. It encourages, for instance, sexual desire, which we find pleasurable. But for people who have too much testosterone, who have problems with their testosterone regulation, this is another avenue. Another disease that's beginning to be discussed about being put into the DSM-4, the Diagnostic Manual for Psychiatry, is the notion of obsessive racism. There are people, anecdotal accounts at this point, of people who walk around constantly obsessed with the fear of Jews or the fear of blacks or the fear of immigrants. And there's very interesting related research to this that comes out of twin studies in England that suggests that your attitudes towards immigrants is actually partly genetically inherited. That this is one of the many characteristics that twins, genetically similar twins, share more than other people do. And so there may be some brain structure, some set of neurochemistry that creates a positive or negative xenophobia in people. And in extreme cases, this may become part of people's psychopathology, where they become obsessively racist or hostile to immigrants. Now, this relates to what's the dominant emerging model, at least in American psychology, about the structure of personality, which this is mainly coming out of statistical analysis of personality surveys. So you ask people hundreds of thousands of questions, the kinds of questions that Bill has, and Bill, in fact, has included in his model, this model of personality, among others. But you do a statistical analysis of these questions, and you find that certain kinds of traits tend to hang together statistically. And there's much debate about whether there's 3 of them or 5 of them and so forth. But these 5 appear to be pretty stable and cross-cultural. So when you go to different countries, different societies may have more or less of one of these, but the same traits hang together in each society. And these are things like neuroticism, which is the degree to which you're obsessed with your personal problems or not. Extroversion, which is the amount of energy that you have and the amount that you communicate and interact with other people. Agreeableness is the degree to which you are trusting of other people and compassionate or otherwise, and again, relates back to the previous idea that there might be some neurochemical basis for trustingness with other kinds of people. Conscientiousness is the notion of the degree to which people want to meet their obligations, the degree to which they're concerned about being precise about particular jobs, or whether they're spontaneous and lose the details, as I often tend to do. And openness to experience is whether they really love learning. There's some suggestion that the love of learning is chemically related to other kinds of pleasure centers in the brain, that when people have an aha experience, they actually get the same kind of neurochemical rewards that people get from nicotine and from alcohol and other kinds of drugs. But at any rate, there's the notion that this is a systematic trait that's set at birth. And all of these traits, you have a certain set point at birth, and you can become a little bit more of this or a little bit less, but it's pretty much neurochemically or genetically determined at birth. Now, a related field of endeavor that's come out of what's called the positive psychology movement in the United States is that this guy, Martin Seligman, was the president of the American Psychological Association. And when he became president in the 1990s, he said, we've been focusing almost exclusively on psychopathology, on illness, and how to treat neuroticism and mental illness. What about the positive side of psychology? How can we become happier? How can we become better people? And what does it mean to become a better person? So he established a commission to investigate different areas of this. What was the happiness research saying about the relationship to health, and what kinds of values do people have cross-culturally that they consider to be virtues? And they summarized about 24 different virtues that they found across many different cultures. And then within those, they had about 6 major sets of virtues. And these are the 6 major virtues that they found in almost every culture. And then they have begun to empirically look at the psychological literature through this lens and say, okay, with this particular analysis of what the structure of human character is and what we consider to be an ideal character for someone, what does it say about what does the literature say about the relationship to happiness and health? And they find, for instance, that there are many kinds of research that suggest that people who are higher on humanity, which is your compassion or your agreeableness in the other model, that people who are higher on that are happier people. Now, again, there's a set point here with the happiness, because happiness has a set point. The degree to which you are happy appears to be strongly genetically determined. About 50% of the degree to which you say you are happy is genetically determined at birth. And things can determine this, things can influence this. If you win the lottery, you're happier for a while, but then you come back down to your happiness set point. If you get a terminal illness, this is very shocking findings coming out of studies of people with terminal illness in the United States. If you get a terminal illness, you're sad for a while, and then you come back up to your happiness set point. Now, if you're already sad, you don't move very much. But if you were happy to begin with, you become happy again. So happiness appears to be relatively inflexible and, again, genetically determined at birth, as are some of these character traits, because they are partly genetically determined by your personality. But the question for a transhumanist then is, well, nothing is really variable in the long term. All of these things will be variable. This model that they have at the top, S plus C plus V equals H, is the model that summarizes the positive psychology movement. The degree of happiness that you have is determined by your happiness set point, the conditions of your life, whether you're in a concentration camp or living in idyllic Finland, and then what you do with your life, the behavior of your life. I forget what V stands for, but it's things like whether you're married, whether you drink, and things like that. And so S is a strong component of that model. V is a relatively weak component. Things like income doesn't have much influence on happiness after $15,000 a year or $20,000 a year. You have very little additional happiness for additional income. Getting married has more. Being religious or a member of a religious community has a little bit more, and so forth. But they see S as a set condition that it can't be changed, and of course we don't. So this is a summary of some of the relationships that one can draw between these set personality characteristics, some of these virtues, and then over here some suggestions about what the potential enhancers of these virtues and personality characteristics might be. And again, the personality model similarly has been related to happiness. The more agreeable you are, the happier you tend to be. The more conscientious you are. Well, conscientiousness is a curve like this, because spontaneity has some advantages and conscientiousness has some advantages. So there's an ideal place in the middle. Neuroticism, obviously, the less neurotic you are, the more happy you are. The more extroverted, the more happy you are, and so on. So let's talk about a couple of these. This is my niece. She's one of the happiest people I know. And I'm not suggesting that she takes ecstasy herself. But this is an ecstasy pill. Ecstasy has been suggested to be a drug, at least by the people who take it, and it hasn't been studied very well, to break down the barrier between self and other, to increase the feelings systematically of love for other people. And there's some suggestion that it changes the structure of the brain permanently in that direction. And so now there are some initial clinical studies being done in the States for the use of ecstasy to determine whether it's useful for psychiatric conditions of one kind or another. And again, there's research that suggests that fear of other people has a genetic or a neurochemical component. So we may have drugs like ecstasy. Oxytocin is another drug that may be useful for increasing agreeableness or humanity in people. Oxytocin is a hormone, neuroactive hormone that's released during breastfeeding and during orgasm. But it's also released when people, well, it's a key component of people bonding with one another. So the degree of oxytocin that you have helps you trust other people and bond with other people. And there's some very interesting research out of Switzerland where they put people in role-playing game situations where they could either trust one another or they could compete against one another. And they found that dosing people with oxytocin without their knowledge led to more cooperative behavior in the games than not. And this, the reports of this last year suggested that diplomats would have to have oxytocin monitors so that they weren't being gassed with oxytocin when they went in to negotiate for different kinds of things. But there are some very interesting international potential implications of this. And this is the study, Neuroactive Hormones and Interpersonal Trust, International Evidence. They went to 32 countries, tested the amount of oxytocin in the blood of people in different countries, and then looked at 100 different variables to see which ones were correlated with the amount of oxytocin in their blood. And there were these set of phytochemicals that were relatively strong correlates of the amount of oxytocin in people's blood. And you can see that the countries in the upper range here of trust, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Canada, countries with relatively social democratic orientations. The countries at the bottom, Colombia, Philippines, Turkey, Peru, Brazil. And this is just the diet, the correlation with diet, that the diet seems to be triggering the release of oxytocin in the people in these countries. In turn, they looked at the international subjective, well, they also looked at studies of asking people if they trust other people, and it was correlated with the amount of oxytocin in their blood. And they looked at studies of the relationship between the amount of oxytocin and the amount of trust in their blood to the happiness of the people in those countries. And here again, you see in the upper quadrant here, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Netherlands, sadly Finland a little bit down, but still in the upper quadrant of all this, and down here at the bottom, Brazil, Turkey, Portugal. So this suggests, and the implication that they make in this study, it's in a journal on biology and economics, is that trust is a key component of all kinds of social cooperation, both economic and political cooperation. So there are serious economic and political consequences of a society being oxytocin deficient. Because you're not able to engage in the same kind of economic activity. You're not able to engage in the same kind of political cooperation as people who have more oxytocin in their blood. Another condition that U.S. Psychology is anxious to treat is social anxiety disorder, or SAD. This is called shyness by other people. But systematic shyness now is considered a treatable condition in the United States, and there are many different kinds of therapies that are used for it. And for many of these kinds of conditions, cognitive behavioral therapy, I don't want to suggest that drugs are the only way to change these things. Cognitive behavioral therapy, where you teach people to think differently, is a very effective way to treat many of these kinds of things. But also SSRIs, the Prozac and so forth, beta blockers, which suppress the fight or flight reflex, other kinds of drugs that calm people down basically and allow them to interact, have been shown to make people less shy who have this kind of phobia, and upwards of 6 or 7% of the population are considered on that end of the bell curve. I just saw this study today, so I threw this in, not to slight the electronic and interactive technologies and their potential benefits. We hear a lot of complaints about the ways that the internet and mediated electronic communication will make us more alienated from one another and reduce social solidarity and ties. And here a study just today came out where researchers suggest that people who play games like Second Life or World of Warcraft or whatever have established social ties through these games that are as important to them, although not quite as deep as face-to-face communication, but are broad, like on MySpace, where you can have 1,000 friends. You can't actually spend time with all those 1,000 friends, but at least you have 1,000 friends. And then it increases your social awareness in other ways, and I think this is a very important experiment at Camp Darfur in Second Life, which is a role-playing environment in Second Life where you go and you adopt the role of a Darfuri, and you have to fight the Janjaweed and try to save your family from being slaughtered, and learn a lot about the situation in the Sudan in the process. And so I think there are many ways that these electronic forms of communication will increase as they already do, in the sense that the more we know about how other people think in other parts of the world, the more cosmopolitan we become, and the more complex our models about empathy for other people's ways of thought become. When we live in a parochial world, we find it incomprehensible how someone could be a Muslim or how someone could be a communist or whatever. At least when we have more communication with them, we begin to understand the way they think. We may not like it, and that may lead to some of its own conflicts. We may like them even less when we understand how they think, but at least we begin to have a more complex model of the world. There's research recently, a study came out last year that suggested that giving people caffeine allowed them to change their mind more often. And there was some debate about what the causes of this were, and so there was another paper that was released a couple months ago where they again gave people in a controlled setting drinks, and in one set of drinks there were doses of caffeine, in another there weren't. And then they exposed them to arguments about things that they were opposed to, and they measured afterwards which group was more likely to change their mind in relationship to the arguments that they had heard. And the group that got the caffeine changed their mind more. And the suggestion is that caffeine stimulated their brain so they're able to pay attention to the arguments better than the other group was. Of course, the media spun this as caffeine makes you more suggestible, which is the other side of it. It's not just that you become more flexible, it's you become more suggestible. But it does suggest that open-mindedness, this characteristic of open-mindedness, may be malleable by some of these attentional mechanisms. And this made a great connection for me because I've been reading about the Enlightenment recently. And it turns out that coffee houses were closely associated with the rise of the Enlightenment. Before the Enlightenment, you had the principal way that men socialized with one another was in alehouses. And as the Enlightenment began to rise, people began to go instead, especially in the morning, but then all through the day, to drink coffee and to read the newspaper and to debate politics and to create what the economists called the first internet. It was a place where all kinds of newspapers and broadsheets were collected. In fact, some of the editors, just like bloggers, had their addresses at a coffee house. You could send mail to them at the coffee house. And you weren't drunk the whole time, so you were able to pay attention to arguments, and you, of course, now we know you were more open-minded as well. Beer, by one anonymous broadsheet writer, was called the foggy ale that besieged our brains, while coffee was that grave and wholesome liquor that heals the stomach, makes the genius quicker, relieves the memory, revives the sad, and cheers the spirits without making mad. So they were also called penny universities because of all the free newspapers. You could go without having to go to the university. They were also classless. Working men and men from the middle class could go and have conversation together. Conscientiousness and emotional control. This is the ability for us to overcome our neuroticism, our degree of getting upset with the things that happen in our lives. It's also the degree to which we can carry through with our commitments. So an example of a disorder that's related to that is, again, something that American psychiatry wants to now treat, intermittent explosive disorder. There's been only one or two epidemiological studies to determine who might fit into a category of explosive disorder, that is, having periods of rage which are overpowering and which cause you to do things you didn't intend to do. There's some suggestion that certain kinds of brain lesions may lead to it. A lot of research has been done in prisons, which the cause and effect there is a little unclear. An average, for people who fit this diagnosis, one NIMH, National Institute of Mental Health study found an average of 43 attacks on other people across their lifetime, averaging $1,400 in property damage. So $1,400 doesn't sound like a lot to me, but the 43 attacks is quite dramatic. I think I haven't gotten in a fist fight since I was 10 years old. So treatments for this are antidepressants, antipsychotics, beta blockers, alpha agonists, phenytoin, mood stabilizers. Again, this is on the vice side, but you can imagine that if we have control over anger on the vice side, eventually we'll be able to suppress anger in situations where we find ourselves doing things out of anger that we didn't intend to do, all the way up to a greater degree of emotional self-control. Now, stepping away from personality for a second and our kind of basic inclinations to be a moral being with other people, there's another model in psychology specifically related to ethics and moral reasoning. And this is the model that Lawrence Kohlberg developed in the 1970s. Kohlberg was influenced by Piaget, who was a child psychologist. Piaget did all kinds of experiments with children where he said, okay, when does a child know that an object really exists? So if you take a ball and you show it to a child and you put it under the table, do their eyes follow under the table waiting for the ball to come back up? Or do they immediately lose interest in the ball as soon as it disappears from their vision because they don't think it exists anymore? And so that's called object permanence. And so he had a series of stages that children go through. You have to have object permanence before you have other kinds of mental processing capabilities. And so there were a series of stages. You couldn't have stage 3 without stage 2 in the Piagetian model. And Kohlberg wondered if the same thing was true of morality, whether being a moral person, having certain kinds of moral logic, was a staged process. And he did international research and a lot of research in the States. And he found that there were 6 stages of moral reasoning, which started with punishment avoidance, which was whatever someone who can hurt me or is in control of me says is right is what's right. So that's the basic stage, your basic childhood stage. Whoever is powerful, whatever they say is right. And then if someone can give something to me, that's right. And then the authority, social order, maintenance is kind of the social contract model, that we have to have rules of right and wrong, otherwise everything will go to hell. Well, the next one, social contract, I forget. I'm not parsing them well. But the final one, universal ethical principle orientation, he only found in a very small subset of adults. The degree to achieve these higher levels of moral reasoning was somewhat correlated with higher education. It was a little bit different by country. But very few adults got to this 6th stage, which was basically a kind of Gandhian or Martin Luther King stage, which said that there's a universal ethic. I have to be subject to that before social ethics, and so if sometimes it's required that I do something that society says is wrong in order to achieve this higher ethic, I will take the consequences for that. So that he considered that the highest level of ethic, and very few people were at that level of ethic. Now, it sounds like a pretty ethnocentric model. He tried to validate it internationally, and found that there was some support for it, and it's come under criticism from feminists and others who consider it far too legalistic and rationalistic. But if you think about the fact that we may eventually have machines interfacing with our brains, and that we already have machines surrounding us in various ways, the notion that we might hold ourselves accountable to a higher ethic that we don't consistently, people, when they answered the questionnaires that determined what stage of ethic they were at, some would respond to one situation at stage 2 and another situation at stage 4. They weren't consistent. You could rank them, generally at a certain stage, but they weren't terribly consistent. And some kinds of questions completely distort our ethical thinking. So if you ask somebody about human enhancement, or if you ask somebody about incest, or if you ask them about cannibalism, or if you ask them about the genetics in Germany, there are things which overwhelm their moral reasoning and don't allow them to be consistent in the way that they're thinking about situations. So this leads me to the idea of a morality PDA. I carry around a PDA that I'm supposed to enter all of the food that I eat into, and which tells me when I get to the top number of calories that I'm supposed to have for the day. Of course, I never enter anything into it, and so what I would like is for it to be able to sit in my glasses or on my tongue and measure automatically the amount of food that I want, and then send a signal to my stomach or to my tongue and saying, okay, now it's time to stop eating, you don't want any more food. That would be the kind of automatic feedback loop that I would like. Otherwise, it's just far too cumbersome. But in the United States, we have the What Would Jesus Do bracelets, which kids wear, and it's supposed to be a constant reminder. Now, I'm supposed to think about, in this situation, what would Jesus do? Well, he would leave his family and go live with a bunch of men out in the wilderness and eventually get killed for being a political dissident. Okay, great, that's what I'm going to do. Also, you have the electronic Bible, which people can carry around in their pocket, and if they have a moral question, they can immediately type up, okay, what does Ezekiel say about premarital sex? But at any rate, we have the potential in the future to have these automatic in our environment and potentially in our brain kinds of morality checkers. And an example, I think, of one that's already in existence is that on some software programs, there's a list of words that you really don't want to use in software that's considered flaming, and it will warn you, it'll highlight your message. Do you really want to send this message with these words in it? That's a pretty useful thing to have. I don't have it turned on mine because, I'm way above that, but I think it might be a useful thing for some. Now, another dimension of morality is the degree to which we are morally autonomous. And this, of course, is an enormous concern. We just heard about surveillance of our behavior, which is related to this as well. And the degree to which we are independent and are able to control our own behavior, I think in the end this is going to become even loosey-gooseier and much more difficult to define. But at least where we are at right now, we have this notion of whether I'm in control or whether I'm being influenced. And we might want to think about the development in the future of morality spam filters, or spam filters for the influence in our lives. And an example for me of this is that Steve Mann, he is the guy in Toronto who wears a pair of glasses that have a camera in them, and then he never sees what's actually in front of him. The camera goes through a computer, and then it goes into a display that he sees in his glasses. And he has it programmed so that when it recognizes an ad, so he has some kind of algorithm for a billboard or an advertisement, it replaces that ad or billboard with his email or a beautiful picture or something that he wants to see instead of that ad. So he's trying to filter out the influences in his environment that might or at least annoy him, if not influence him. And I think we can think about this in a similar way. There's lots of evidence that the degree of threat that people perceive in their environment, the degree of violence that they perceive in society, increases their tolerance for authoritarianism and for authoritarian leadership. So this was pointed out in the last election when the Bush administration was very carefully moderating the threat level assessment of how threatening terrorism was, and was arresting groups of Christian fundamentalist teenagers who they had entrapped into being terrorists in the United States, and saying that this was another al-Qaeda plot in the United States. And every time any regime, and of course the same thing was suggested in Russia when buildings were blowing up and people thought that it was an attempt to boost support for Putin, and it's happened in many regimes, this notion that there is an attempt to portray society as out of control so that people will turn to authoritarian leadership. If we had more control over our own sense about those things and are able to parse out those influences on our thinking, we might not be so subject to influence by others. So my conclusion with this is that I think with transhuman neurotechnologies, we have the capability to build a society in which we are happier, more intelligent, more self-aware, potentially more independent of other influences to the degree that that's desirable, more socially minded, and have better moral and political decision-making, and I do reference some of that in Citizen Cyborg. But I think there are also some serious risks here, as you might have already imagined. There's the risk of, for instance, brain fingerprinting, which is that neuroimaging technologies are now being used with a lot of financing from American Homeland Security to say, well, if we show you a bunch of pictures, including George Bush and Osama bin Laden, and your pleasure center goes on when you see Osama bin Laden, and your disgust center goes on when you see George Bush, doesn't that suggest something about the kind of person you are and whether we should let you into the United States? And so there's these kind of terrorist brain fingerprints are being sought. And we might, if we then found that somebody had a systematically bad set of mental responses, we might then say, well, we should put you on the Prozac or give you the morality PDA that will systematically retrain you. And you remember, of course, what was the movie about violence with Beethoven? What? Well, Clockwork Orange, right, with the classic scene where he's got his eyes wired open, he's being shown images and given the shocks and everything. So, this is a potential rehabilitative technology that I think we have to be very conscious might be out there. There is the possibility that people in a purely liberal framework might take drugs that would bliss them out, make them insensate to the kinds of oppression that they live under, and not be the kind of dynamic, engaged citizens that we want them to be. If you read The Hedonistic Imperative by David Pierce, one of the founders of the WTA, he parses out this question very interestingly. He says, there's no evidence that people in the top 10 percentile of happiness set point are systematically more passive or less engaged with their world. In fact, it's depression that makes you less passive and engaged. There's been this whole debate about whether SSRIs cause people to commit suicide. They do kind of cause people to commit suicide because when you're really, really depressed, you're too depressed even to kill yourself. And when you take an SSRI, you get a little bit less depressed, and then you think, okay, now I can finally kill myself. But across that whole spectrum, the degree of neuroticism and depression that you experience is the degree to which you are not able to engage with the world and change the world. And so when you look at the history of revolutions, rising expectations, optimism, hope can be as much a cause of political change as people being really, really bummed out. In fact, being really, really bummed out can be a cause for people not doing anything. Amoral workers and soldiers. This is a scenario in which you might imagine I do imagine that if you go into a battlefield and you find it difficult to shoot innocent people or people that you haven't met before, you might be given a drug that would help you overcome that kind of compassion or innate humanity for your fellow human being. If you go into the workplace and you need to be extra competitive, 5? 2, 1, okay. If you go into the workplace and you are less competitive, you might take something which suppresses your innate humanity so that you can become a more competitive person. And these kinds of pressures might make you, might encourage society to use these technologies in ways that we don't like. Another example might be the degree to which we might encourage people to conform to society instead of change society. So imagine if you have a sex, if you're transgendered and you go to the doctor and you say, I'm a woman living in a man's body. Right now, the doctor can say, well, over time, we could transform your body to become a woman's body and eventually you could live as a woman. But in the future, you might be able to go to the doctor and he could say, well, we can either give you this pill that can make you feel like you're a man in a man's body, or we can transform your body to become a woman in a man's body. Now, I don't know if it's morally preferable to do one or the other. I think it should be up to each individual to choose. But it would mean that there would be less pressure on society to accept those kinds of differences. And people might find that the path of least resistance is the path that they wanted to take. And not to bash China too much, but just as a final comment, I'll say I'm very concerned about the use of these technologies in authoritarian countries that don't have the same kind of liberal democratic traditions and values that we have, that the Enlightenment has attempted to spread throughout the world, and in which people seem much more oriented towards forms of conformity than towards individual rights and expression. So, in conclusion, we could have a better world or we could have a worse world, as many of the talks have said. And the difference will be made by whether we, transhumanists and others who are our allies in these fights, fight for the importance of cognitive liberty. That's what will make the difference. It's not the technologies which will make the difference, because as I pointed out, there are many technologies already being used which have the potentials for the negatives and the potentials for the positives. It's not the technologies which will make the difference. The difference will be made by whether we create the kinds of societies that will protect people's rights to use these technologies in self-chosen ways, and that give them the messages about the kinds of people we think people should become, right? We don't want a purely liberal society in this regard, because a purely liberal society might end up in various kinds of dead ends that we wouldn't want to have. And so we want to tell people, liberal, but there are boundaries. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was again a very interesting presentation. I have a lot of because I was not able to listen to most of these for technical reasons on my own part. So we will be taking a couple of more short questions before we continue. The one here.
I'll try to make it short this time. Hughes often stressed that we should separate clearly the power politics from the technologies. But an analogy could be made, and it's a bit provocative, but it's not necessarily intended that way, that the leftists of America often also, in the struggle against the NRA, they don't want guns in the houses lying there. And you could just as well say, okay, the guns are there, and that's just a technology which might be useful if you say self-defense is okay, but it's inextricably involved with the contextual possibility that you can't predict that the kids might take it and start a Columbine or shoot themselves in the head or something. So could you not say that that it's impossible to divide it that clearly?
I do think that it's not a question simply of, let me backtrack. Some technologies need to be banned because they pose too great a risks and for too few benefits. An example of a neurotechnology which is in that category might be the date rape drug, which I'm spacing on the name of. Date rape, you put it in a woman's drink, she becomes sleepy and suggestible. Anyway, it's a common cause of date rape in the United States now. It has very little medical purpose, and so people can be arrested if they have it in their possession, and they're presumed to be using it for a bad purpose. I think that's the kind of power that you might have over somebody else with the neurotechnology that should be banned. Similarly, we would want to ban the use of certain neurotechnologies by the state, because we would want to protect individual liberty and brain privacy from the use of certain kinds of technologies, like routine brain scanning of some kind. You know, you should have to have a warrant before you scan my brain for Osama bin Laden. So I think there are technologies that should be banned, but it's not. But the problem is not the technology itself; it's the power relations and the consequences of the technology within a particular context.
Okay, I think that because people have very strange idea of short question,